Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Aussie Aliens and Unidentified Aerial Phenomena series. In this episode, we take a look at part 2 of Peter Khoury's encounter. This encounter was different. On this occasion, they were women and they were naked. Succubus or extraterrestrial? Much of Peter Khoury's encounter comes from Bill Chalker's book, Hair of the Alien, where he helped Peter Khoury work out what it was that came to him that morning. Peter was in bed quite a lot after this head injury that he sustained from these men on the construction site. He was still able, though, to drive Vivian to the station, but he vomited quite a lot, as we spoke about in the previous episode. He's on Voltaren now. He's opted away from the Prozac or Valium. He's only taking Panadeine Forte, which is really just a strong Panadol, and Voltaren, which is like a muscle relaxant. So he's not on anything that could possibly alter his vision or cause hallucinations or anything like this. But what happens to Peter on Thursday the 23rd of July is something that no one can ignore. On Thursday the 23rd of July of 1992, he got up as usual and dropped her off, stopping a few times to be sick, as he's still nursing the head injuries from a month and a bit prior. Afterwards, he went straight home and back to bed. He thinks it must have been about 7:05 a.m, still in his clothing. Being July in Australia, it's right in the middle of winter, so going to bed with your clothes on wasn't that unusual. And he's sick, remember, so he's just going to basically want to go straight back to bed. Within a few minutes, he was asleep. But only about 25 minutes later, he felt a presence in the room. He'd felt something, like he stated, was like a cat jumping up onto the bed. You could feel something pressed down on the bed, but it wasn't heavy like a human. It stepped lightly. As he sat up, he's looking straight at two females sitting on his bed naked. Now, I don't know about you, but a fella waking up seeing two naked women on his bed is probably a fantasy for most men, maybe some women too. But for Peter, he's sick. He's had probably limited sleep. His head hurts and he's been vomiting that morning. He's not interested in anything sexual, you wouldn't think anyway, but he was quite surprised. He was still trying to work out if he was awake or not at this point, seeing two women naked on his bed at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the fact that the feeling or the impression on the bed was so light, didn't feel like a human woman was sitting across from him. Peter was wondering how the hell they got in there. He was shocked and confused, but not in fear. They were almost transparent-like, as his eyes were beginning to adjust to them. He said as he was waking up, it was almost like an out-of-body experience. He kind of saw himself sitting up on the bed across from them, like he was somewhere else in the room, watching it all play out. It may have been part of him waking up at the time, or could one of these female beings have been trying to possess him, knock him out of his body? As he was studying the females on his bed, he noticed one was blonde, a fair woman, directly in front of him, and then another woman to the right of her, sitting on the corner. And that second woman was of an Asian appearance, but still not quite human, either of them. Peter was still trying to work out how these women or intruders got in. The house was locked. It was no longer the house where his family lived. He'd moved out since then with Vivian. Peter says the blonde being was sitting on her legs, as if they were folded underneath, sitting on her calves. Describing how she looked, she was blonde. Best she would have been in her mid-30s. She had good skin, and her hair was strangely styled, blown back like overdone. He likened it to Farrah Fawcett back in the day, but an extreme version, overstyled, made up exotically to become attractive or look attractive. She had high protruding cheekbones with a long nose on a longer than normal or human face, but it didn't look ugly, just not normal for a human. Peter said her eyes were about 2 times or 3 times bigger than a normal human's eyes. He knew she wasn't human by looking at her. The rest of her body seemed human, and anatomically, everything was proportioned well. Just the head and the face were not human, and the way that she sat up on the bed looked too straight for the average human. She had a pointy chin, as well as the hair seemed frail or flimsy, not strong like a woman's hair usually is. Her eyes were bluish in colour, and her skin very fair. The female of Asian appearance looked a little bit more human, not as tall, as he imagined that a blonde would have been taller than him, and he stood around 6 foot. Peter states that the female of Asian appearance had very dark, almost too dark skin for that type of appearance. More fitting would be someone of maybe African descent or Indian descent rather than Asian, as they have a lighter coloured skin. So he thought that that was very unnatural that she had such dark skin. She had dark hair and eyes. He could not see the whites of her eyes. They were as large as the blonde's eyes. She too was naked, but he imagined her height would be shorter than him, but not by too much, about 5 foot 8 inches. Her cheeks, though, were very high and puffy, like inflamed. She was positioned on the corner of the bed next to the blonde, but side on, as if she were watching the both of them and how they interacted. Almost like she was studying them or learning from the way the blonde moved and acted with Peter. Both female beings sat upright. The Asian sat more so on her knees than on her calves, as the blonde was, possibly to make themselves seem the same height. One thing Peter noticed about the being of Asian appearance, her hair seemed too straight down to her shoulders and didn't move. It was almost like it wasn't really hair. If this was a fantasy for most men, it definitely wasn't a fantasy for Peter, as all these little bits and pieces were coming into his mind about how they looked. It was seeming more and more like a nightmare. And remember, he's with Vivian, he's not a single man. She is his childhood sweetheart. He wouldn't have even possibly thought to cheat with a human woman, let alone beings not of this earth. As Peter is still trying to absorb everything that's in front of him, the blonde sitting in front of him cupped her hands around his head as if she was stunned that he woke up, and pulled his head towards her breast. Peter felt very uncomfortable and pulled away, but straight away she brought his head back to her breast with a bit more force. Peter struggled to pull away, but managed to get back. This time she used more force, and he could not move away. As his face went to her breast and her nipple, he took a bite as to release himself. He figured that this was probably the only way he could get away. But as he bit, he felt something, a chunk, come away, like it was biting into rubber and a piece had come into his mouth. But it hit the back of his throat and stung. And he began coughing. It was a foreign thing in his throat, and he tried to swallow it down, but it was like lodged in his throat. He couldn't get it down. So he began coughing uncontrollably. Peter says that as he bit her nipple, she didn't scream or cry out, as you would imagine a human woman would. There was no blood. He looked up at the blonde, and she was confused and quite shocked at what he'd done. She looked at the being of Asian appearance, and they were looking at each other. Peter felt like they were telepathically talking between each other, as if this was not meant to happen. He's done it wrong. This is not the way to do it. Don't remember this. Peter was shocked at how much strength that the blonde had. He was quite fit, being in the construction industry, but he struggled to pull away from her. And she didn't look strong, but had very strong power to her. Peter began coughing again, and then when he looked back up, both had disappeared. He got up to get himself a drink of water to try and swallow down or drink down whatever it was that was making him cough and being stuck in his throat. It didn't seem to work. After drinking down the water and continuing to cough, he needed to use the bathroom, so he went ahead to the toilet and began to try and go. But he was in excruciating pain, like a bladder infection. He couldn't go. He felt as if he'd been cut. After examining, he realised that there was hair wrapped around the end of his penis. He had a look down. There were actually 2 hairs. One was a curly one, another one straight, but wrapped so tightly and embedded into his skin. It was like nylon string, he said. Unwrapping this string was very painful. He says the straight one was about 10 to 12 centimetres long, and the curly one about 6 to 8 centimetres long. They were very frail looking, whitish in colour, like fishing line colour, see-through almost. He placed these samples in a Ziploc bag. He knew somehow that it came from the blonde being, but she hadn't been intimate with him, not that he remembered. He still had his clothing on, although the legs of his pants had been raised upward. How could she have been intimate with him while he was still clothed? He rang Vivian straight away to tell her that something had happened, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her exactly what occurred. Naked women on his bed, what would she think? How would she react? So he just told her about the coughing fit and that something had happened. And he would tell her more about it later on, but just to remember this time and date. Pondering over what had happened, Peter thought that he could have handled the encounter better, but being quite sick and confused at what they were trying to do worried him. At the time, he reacted. It was a spur-of-the-moment reaction to what was going on. She was pressing his face into her breast what could he do? He remembered there being no intimate feeling, no emotion from the blonde. It felt very mechanical. He did not remember any sexual act being committed at all, just that she brought his head to her breast. The hair being wrapped around his penis, he said, had to have been manually put there. It couldn't have been put there any other way if they hadn't have had any intimacy or sexual act. How on earth could it have been wrapped so tightly if not manually done by hand? He couldn't understand it at all. He does not remember ever being aroused at the time, just confused and shocked. One thing he did remember though, and he'd spoken to Bill about this, was that he was fully clothed and under the sheets, but when the encounter happened, he realised he was above the sheets. He does not know also how his pant legs were brought up to his knees. Could he have been knocked out so much so by these beings that he doesn't remember an act being committed? Perhaps this was coming to the end of the act and whatever power they had over him had worn off. It wasn't a very long time, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, between when he fell asleep, he believed, and when he woke up. When he rang Vivian, it was just after she'd gotten into the office, around 8:30, so the encounter must have been around a 30-minute encounter. It was some time before he could tell Vivian what had transpired, about 3 weeks, and surprisingly, she accepted from Peter what had happened. She even stated that, well, he had no control over what the beings did. And remember, she's seen a UFO with him, and he's experienced other things. She believes him, and she trusts him. It was very difficult for Peter to come out to the people in the UFO group he was attached to. He had a close friend who helped open up a new UFO chapter called the UFO Experience Support Association, or UFO ESA, based in Sydney. It's a lonely thing to have something happen to you that you can't relate to anyone about and you can't talk to anyone about. And like myself doing a Google search back in 2006, there was nothing. Nobody had had an experience like I'd had, and nobody had had an experience like Peter Khoury. He was alone, aside from his family and Vivian, who believed he'd had encounters. They couldn't really understand what he went through in a way, as they had not experienced it for themselves. It took Peter a long time to come out to people, and it took him a long time to come out to Bill Chalker as well. Peter had proof of his encounter, and it would be tested. Not just their hairs, but Peter too would be tested sometime later. It would be 6 to 7 years before Bill Chalker, who Peter eventually came out to about the encounter, would find the right scientists or biochemical associates who would be the best for the job. Remembering again that even his friends at the UFO group posed judgment, so too could scientists, and of course the doctors and psychologists and hypnotherapists wouldn't go near him. They didn't believe him. But Bill did find the right people, and the tests proved out of this world. The methods used to analyse the hair sample were ones used by the FBI, analysing DNA from crime scenes. This was now 1998 to 1999, as this new technology was coming out, or this new way of doing things was now able to be done. They would also take a sample from Peter's thick black hair and of Vivian's normal brown hair, which was of course nothing like the appearance of that clear hair from what Peter believed had been the blonde being's hair. They found that Peter's was in the normal human DNA range. Vivian's hair had been heat damaged, possibly from blow drying, as women do, been too heat damaged to be able to take samples from. God, I'd like to see them try and get a sample out of my bleached hair. But they weren't too worried, as Vivian was not there when the beings were in the room. They could see from the hair samples that they were not a match. As they tested the shaft of the blonde hair, they found that it was very rare. Although it was shown to have, in part, relatable human parts, it also differed. It was found to have a part only found in rare Chinese Mongoloid DNA. And even stranger, their hair was blonde or clear in colour, rather than that expected from the Chinese Mongoloid type. It would have been black. Rarer DNA than that of the known rarest DNA found in African pygmies and aborigines. The hair appeared to have come from someone more of Scandinavian lineage, not of Chinese or Oriental. They ruled out that Peter could have met a Chinese woman or Oriental person with bleached blonde hair, as they could not have obtained a sample as they did. Even Vivian obviously had trouble with her hair being too heat damaged, so bleaching would be obviously way harder to get samples off. They were 100% sure that from the sample they were easily able to extract DNA from was not tampered at all. They had the rarest type of DNA ever encountered. An entity or being that was close to human genetics but had little or no melanin in the skin, as may not have needed it, being that they had little or no contact with the sun. Although it was not quite proof of an extraterrestrial though, the results were too bizarre. They ruled out all other possibilities, including a rare albino type of DNA. Extensive washing of the hair sample before tests ruled out any other contaminations. The hair also had a root attached, where further studies or hair root analysis was performed. The root brought about more amazement and confusion, for what they found in the root sample was of a rare Basque or Gaelic type. The Basque ethnic group came from a region of southwest France and northwest Spain. A 2015 scientific study of the DNA believed that the Basque people today are descendants of Neolithic farmers who mixed with local Mesolithic hunters before becoming isolated from the rest of Europe for millennia. They also found Gaelic type DNA, which is thought to have been traced back to a common paternal ancestor who lived approximately 2,000 to 2,600 years ago in the area that borders France and Germany, similar areas of the Basque and Gaelic people. Therefore, they had a sample with two rare types of DNA, Chinese Mongoloid type on the shaft of the hair and Basque or Gaelic type on the root sample. How strange. Bill spoke to Carrie Mullis, who was the American biochemist that discovered PCR, polymerase chain reaction, the process of cloning or copying DNA to have more of it to test on, which Bill says came in very handy, being that they only had the small hair sample to do all of the tests they needed to do on. Carrie Mullis won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1993 for this discovery, Fascinatingly, Khoury tells Bill of his own strange happening in 1985 that was either extraterrestrial or, like mine, more of a brush with an interdimensional being. In his own book, he notes this, his book being Dancing Naked in the Minefield, where not only did Khoury, but his daughter, Louise, and a close friend of his, lost time outside of his cabin in Anderson Valley. They didn't lose time together. This was 3 separate occasions at this cabin, and Khoury lost 6 hours approximately of time after talking to what he believes was a raccoon, and it spoke to him. A raccoon. And this is a Nobel Prize winner. We're not talking about the mumblings of a drunk or drug user. This guy discovered how to copy and clone DNA. He's not an idiot. What did he see, or what was he meant to see? What did they want him to see? See, it's very strange. They can change what you perceive happened when reality something else is happening. It's very strange and a little scary. I've been reading Richard Dolan's book Alien Agendas, and at one point he has a story of a woman who boards a train and realizes after a little while aboard the train that she's on the train with beings that aren't human, one in which has an unravelling hand like he was wearing a human suit, and it was unravelling at his fingers. So strange. I mean, you could put that off as maybe this chick was, off a nut or something on drugs, but these people aren't on drugs. These people are average people going about their average lives, and this kind of thing comes into their world. You really have to keep an open mind to all of these stories. But when you've got something like Peter Khoury, proof that it actually happened, you can't deny that. Bill mentions also in his book, The Hair of the Alien, that the date of when this particular event for Peter Khoury with the 2 women occurred was a little hazy. His sister-in-law had been murdered, and he had that beating in 1992. He seemed to believe that this encounter happened around the time of his head injury. Bill finds that there was a taped interview from members of the UFO group where Peter stated that the encounter with the women, extraterrestrial women, happened in 1991 or earlier in 1992 than the July that he told Bill. Bill gets hold of this tape and hears that there are some differences to the encounter, such as that the Asian-appearing being was closest to him. He suggests Peter see a hypnotist. Bill organises for a hypnosis regression session with Dr. John Mack, Harvard psychologist. He knew John Mack would be available. Dr. Mack was in Australia on a conference, but was happy to help out. The session was very good. This revealed more about his 1988 encounter though, not the encounter Bill was actually hoping for, but it was quite interesting. After being touched at the head with the crystal tube by that being, Peter says in the regression that he was in a room with white lit up walls as if the walls were the light source, and an entity, a shadowy tall figure, told him something, and all Peter could remember at the moment, he was worried that he wouldn't remember what the being was telling him, and that's all they got from that particular session. Bill knew there was so much more that they could obtain. So a couple of years later, he organises for Peter to have a hypnotic regression session with hypnotist and member of the Australian Institute of Parapsychological Research, Rob Tilley. This was 2003. Now, during this session, more of the female encounter takes place. He recalls most of the same information initially, but that the Asian woman tells him telepathically that this baby will join the other babies, and that the Asian had a protruding tummy. Perhaps she was pregnant, but he also wasn't sure if it was just the way she was sitting, that it looked that way, although she was talking about babies. After Peter bites the blonde at the breast, she pushes him away, and Peter hears them saying telepathically that it's not like last time. It shouldn't be like this. He's doing it wrong this time. After he fell into his coughing fit after biting her and looks up that they're gone, he still gets the sense that they're still there, as he hasn't seen them leave. He noticed that the bed was perfectly made, like it hadn't been slept in. But he was on top of it, and he knows he was under the covers when he first went to sleep. He walks to the kitchen as he's coughing, and he needs to get this thing that's in his throat out or down. In this regression, instead of getting water, he eats a bit of Lebanese bread first to try and get it down, catch it from his throat and swallow it down. And then he drinks the water, and then needs to use the toilet. But he has that sense of feeling that they're still in the house, as he hasn't seen them physically leave, that he's being watched, and that they're still not finished with him. After the regression with Rob Tilley, Bill has Peter listen to the interview tape that the UFO members had recorded back in late 1991 before his head injury. And in this case, it is role reversed. He wakes up to find that the woman of Asian appearance is straddling him, not like the other time where it was the blonde. So now he says that the blonde was straddling him in the other encounter. She had been teaching the blonde, who was wearing overalls that he hadn't remembered from when he originally told Bill about the encounter, therefore indicating that that encounter had been sexual, and, as a result, recovering the hair samples. The events that Peter recalled when he first spoke to Bill, to the events of Rob Tilley's regression, and then again that of the interview tape from the end of 1991, there were some differences between all three stories. And Bill starts to believe that there was more than one encounter with the women. One in the beginning, where the being of Asian appearance is teaching the blonde, and then an encounter when Peter was sick, where the blonde was the main role and the Asian appearing being was supervising this particular encounter. After the regression and Peter listening to the interview tape that he'd done back in 1991, they all came to the realisation that the encounters were for the making of babies. Hybrid babies. Bill also writes in his book that Rob Tilley regresses him again, and Peter remembers a later encounter, one from 1996, where he is asleep at home at night, Vivian in bed with him, when he is awoken and looking into the mirror of his wardrobe. Small, dark-hooded beings like those of the 1988 encounter come through. So quickly he describes them, many of them, crowding around the bed, and Peter is lifted off the bed. Vivian stays asleep. Peter describes himself as levitating, that the beings were not touching him. Then they move forward through the mirror, guiding his levitation through. He is quite scared as he goes through the mirror and describes it as stepping in jelly and then having something across his face. at feeling like cotton. He seems to be on a craft then, but then only remembers the whole event playing in reverse, and then he is back in his bed, with the regression ended. Very similar this is to Whitley Strieber being taken from the room while his wife was asleep, or kept asleep. Unlike others who have had experiences, Peter has never shied away from the media. He had the proof that backed his story up, which probably sets him apart from the others who were ridiculed and couldn't stand up against it with any proof.
I was 23 years old at the time, and they would have been 3 to 4 foot in height, wearing hoods or robes, shiny dark face. Their skin was like a shiny black leathery look to it. They had the oval, big, large black eyes, goldish coloured skin.
But Peter has done polygraph tests to prove that the encounter truly happened, and this is a little snippet of that result.
Okay, Peter, the test is about to begin. I'm now going to get you to close your eyes for me. Keep your feet flat on the floor. Don't move, and answer each test question truthfully. Is today Wednesday?
Yes.
Is your first name Peter?
Yes.
Do you intend to deliberately lie to any test question?
No.
In July 1988, did you definitely witness 5 aliens in your bedroom at your parents' home in Hurlston Park?
Yes.
Did you lie to me when you said you definitely witnessed 5 aliens in your bedroom at your parents' home in Hurlston Park?
No.
Okay, Pete, test is now over. Just... Peter passed the test.
Great. I'm happy.
So, as far as I'm concerned, what he witnessed, there has to be some merit in that.
The polygraph test has validated Peter's account of the events and reinforced his belief that the scientific community need to take this matter seriously.
You could say we are really lucky that this encounter happened to Peter. I don't know how he feels about it, whether he feels lucky or not. But, well, it seems they chose Peter. From birth, it seems. He was selected early on by these extraterrestrials, and his life now has been to get the message out that they are real. They've given an opportunity for Peter to prove that they're real, as well as Peter offering support to others who have had such encounters. The world is pretty lucky to have him too. But to have proof from an encounter in Australia, some of the only proof there is available that extraterrestrials actually exist or beings exist, is amazing. We are lucky to have this to confirm what most of us already know, and to confirm what many abductees and people who've had encounters have been saying for hundreds of years. Finally, we have proof that they are here. And they are interacting with us, some more than others. I really have to stop the video here, otherwise I'll have to make part 3 and it'll just be me rambling about how amazing this whole episode was. Even though this is probably the most fascinating of all the abduction stories, especially in Australia, we do have many more stories to come. So if you enjoyed this episode, definitely click like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more unidentified aerial phenomena and Aussie ETs.
DNA went a long way to helping people believe. Hopefully with a polygraph to back it, people can then sit back and say, well, if the guy's not lying, there's got to be something there, you know, and if there's something there, and if it's 5% of all the reports around the world, if 5% of those reports are legitimate, and mine is part of that, then geez, we've got a phenomena we need to look at.
I mean, the results actually haven't surprised me, because I've always believed Peter, and I know that he's got absolutely nothing to gain by saying something so incredible.